This is section 2.1. This is part 3. We're going to talk about being able to identify domain and range from continuous graphs. And they're a little bit different from just naming, from ordered pairs. Okay, so when we look at the domain from a continuous graph, and what I mean by continuous graph is when you look at this graph here, you'll notice you don't just have ordered pairs, you don't just have dots on the graph, you have lines. Okay, and those lines are going to include everything in between them, not just one point. Okay, so as we look at this here, these domains are going to be slightly different than just a regular domain and range. Okay, so the domain, as we identify the domain, okay, for the most part, it's really pretty simple in terms of how to identify it. Okay, where does the graph begin and end on the x-axis? That's essentially how you're going to identify this, okay? Now, how you're going to write it out is you're going to write this out as an AND statement. So it's going to look like this with an X in the middle, okay? This is the furthest right the graph goes, and this is the furthest left the graph goes with an X in the middle. Okay, for a rough example, it would be maybe, let's say the graph goes from 0 to 4 on the x-axis. Okay, now the range is going to be, again, where does it begin and end on the y-axis? So you're going to have a y in the middle. Again, it's going to be an AND statement. This is going to be the furthest right, or furthest above, and furthest below. Okay. So now as we look at this, again, you'll start to see this. Again, it could be an example of maybe it goes from -3 to 5 on the y-axis. Okay. When I start going through an example, you'll understand a little bit better what that means. Okay. So let's take a look here at this first example. All right. So again, as you look at the x-axis only to start for the domain, remember, x-axis. What is the furthest left on the x-axis that it goes? Well, if I were to take and draw essentially a box around this shape, okay, from left to right. Now, I've covered up this shape. The furthest left is the left side of the box. The furthest right is the right side of the box. The furthest below and the furthest above is the bottom and the top. So as you look at the domain in this case, okay, x, the furthest left it goes on the x-axis, it doesn't go past 0. This is the 0 on the x-axis right here. Okay, this is the 0 on the x-axis right here. It doesn't go any further left of that. So my furthest left point is going to be 0. My furthest right point here, the curve of this shape came like this. The furthest right point is at this point, which happens to be at the point 2. So your domain covers from 0 to +2. Now your range is essentially up and down. What's the lowest point? What's the highest point? And again, we're going to put a y in the middle. So as you look here at the box that I've created over our shape, the lowest point that our x or our y value will go is right here on the y-axis is -2. Again, the range is how high and how low we go. The domain is how much left and how much right we go. Okay? So in this case, we go from -2 for a y, and then the highest that it goes up here is at +2. So in this case, the range goes from -2 to +2 on the graph. Okay? Now, if I were to take and move my picture here a little bit, like so. I move the box now out of there, and now I move this over. You'll notice, again, as you're looking at this, the furthest left it goes is at the x, or is at the y-axis, which is x equals 0. The furthest right it goes all the way up to 2. It doesn't go past 2. And then below, the lowest it goes is at -2, and the highest it goes is at +2. And that's how we do the domain and range. Okay, so let's take a look here at this one now, and let's figure out our domain and our range. Okay, now I'm going to draw a box around this, but I'm not going to cover it up this time. So I'm just going to draw, in this case, I'll put it as blue, and I'm just going to draw the blue box around my shape here, because this is going to help me. Okay, so on the domain, the furthest left it goes is at -1. So I've got -1 is less than or equal to x is less than or equal to, the furthest right it goes is +3 on the x-axis. Okay, essentially I'm giving you the dimensions of my box that I've drawn through the shape. The lowest that it goes is at 0. So for the range, the lowest it goes is 0. And the highest it goes all the way up to +4. Okay, so this covers everything between 0 and 4, which is covering the shape from 0 to 4 that way. And the domain covers everything from -1 all the way to 3 this way. So it covers everything in the shape. Okay, let's take a look at this one. Now this one's a little bit different, because you'll notice on this one it's not all enclosed in. Okay, and on this one here, as we look, you'll see that you have 2 arrows at the end. Okay, so that's going to mean something. The arrows mean that it is continuous. It means it continually goes on and on and on. So as you look here at domain and range, since it has an arrow, it still is going. You just don't see it. So if it were to keep going, as this arrow here were to keep going and going and going and going, what would that point clear out there be? Well, we would measure that as what we call negative infinity, and it's a sidewards 8. And you'll notice again you have the arrow here, which means it's going to keep going and going and going and going and going. And where does it go to? Well, it's going to go all the way to positive infinity. Okay, so in this case, in this picture, anytime you see an arrow, that means it's continuous. It means it keeps going. It doesn't stop. Now, the range, the y-axis. What is the lowest that this shape will go? Well, it doesn't go below this line right here. Okay, it doesn't go below that. And that line happens to be 0. So my range is going to be, the lowest it goes is 0. But you'll notice both arrows, again, mean that they just keep going up and up and up and up. And they keep going up. We don't know how high it goes. So it's going to keep going up all the way to positive infinity. Okay, now, you're not going to have a lot of these in terms of the continuous ones. A lot of them you're going to see are like the ones where you see circle ones like this, okay, or example on the last page where you had a half a circle, okay. So this concludes 2.1 part 3, which talks about finding domain and range of continuous graphs.